603 of the Trump administration. And while it has not diminished the damage it is delivering, Florence is now thankfully a tropical storm. Still tonight pounding the Carolinas, and we'll have a late live update just ahead in this broadcast. But we begin with a huge announcement today that Paul Manafort, the man who offered to work for Donald Trump for free, is tonight working for the feds. The man who has enjoyed the good life after a lifetime of orbiting at or near the very top of the Republican political solar system has been living in jail of late. And today, Donald Trump's former campaign chairman, already a convicted felon, pleaded guilty to 2 federal counts and made a deal to cooperate in all ways with special counsel Robert Mueller. By doing so, Paul Manafort has admitted to conspiring against the United States and conspiring to obstruct justice. He now also avoids a second trial in federal court. The deal he signed with prosecutors orders him to, and we quote, cooperate fully, truthfully, completely, and forthrightly with the government in any and all matters as to which the government deems the cooperation relevant. You may recall President Trump was sympathetic to Manafort during his second trial, praising him for not breaking under pressure from the feds.
One of the reasons I respect Paul Manafort so much is he went through that trial. You know, they make up stories. People make up stories. This whole thing about flipping, they call it. I know all about flipping. For 30, 40 years, I've been watching flippers. It almost ought to be outlawed. It's not fair.
Tonight, the Wall Street Journal spoke to the president about Manafort's plea deal. They report that Trump denied the Manafort case had anything to do with him, saying, quote, I got hit with an artificial witch hunt that should never have happened. The plea deal also says Manafort must forfeit several properties, including homes in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Hamptons in New York. He also will give up his apartment in Trump Tower. Manafort's attorney offered this explanation for his client's decision.
Tough day for Mr. Manafort, but he's accepted responsibility, and he wanted to make sure that his family was able to remain safe and live a good life. He's accepted responsibility, and this is for conduct that dates back many years, and everybody should remember that.
Interesting note there about Manafort's family's safety, and we'll get to that later in our discussion. As for reaction from the president's legal team, Rudy Giuliani appeared on Sean Hannity's program earlier this evening.
The plea agreement and the cooperation agreement has nothing to do with the Trump campaign. The reality is no evidence of collusion. All you have to do is look at the plea. The plea is to crimes that have to do with Manafort's past. No involvement with President Trump, no involvement with the campaign, no involvement with Russia.
There is also this report in the New York Times about Trump's former lead counsel. Quote, John Dowd, Mr. Trump's former lawyer, emailed lawyers representing other clients who have been drawn into Mr. Mueller's inquiry that Mr. Manafort, quote, has no info on president or campaign. We should be crystal clear here. No one has any idea what John Dowd is basing that on. Earlier on this network, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, who, while not working for Trump, has been accused of being a cable news water carrier for the president of late, says the White House should be alarmed about the Manafort plea deal and adds that any possibility of a pardon now seems remote.
He'd have been much better off pardoning early rather than waiting until he's already cooperated. So I don't think we're going to see any kind of a pardon at this point.
As to what Manafort can offer Mueller et al., let's remember he was present at the Trump Tower meeting with the visiting Russians, having done business in that part of the world for years and worked for a number of powerful Russians himself. He's also been in business with Roger Stone, a key figure in all of this, who has not been called in yet. Tonight, NBC News is reporting Manafort has already had initial conversations with the Mueller team. It's a lot to talk about at the end of a long week. Let's bring in our leadoff panel on a Friday night. Michael Schmidt, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times Washington correspondent. Josh Gerstein, senior White House reporter for Politico. Barbara McQuaid, veteran federal prosecutor, former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. And Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA and Pentagon, former chief counsel for the House Intel Committee. Welcome to you all. Josh, you were in court for the entire first Manafort trial. You were in the courthouse for what happened today. Put this in perspective. How big a development is this?
Oh, it's a pretty significant development. I mean, Manafort had put up such a strong fight up to this point. Remember, at that first trial, he had no fewer than 5 lawyers present fighting that case for him. So for him to make this abrupt about-face with this trial coming down on him, where we're going to hear 3 weeks of testimony, a lot of it probably having to do with issues of foreign influence, of his ties to Ukrainian oligarchs, many of whom also have interests in Russia. I think it could have been pretty unpleasant both for Mr. Manafort and for the Trump campaign, Trump associates, the Trump White House. And so while the plea is definitely bad news for the president, you know, a trial would have been pretty bad news for him as well.
And Michael, looking back on your interview with Donald Trump, I think this was in December. The direct quote was, "I've always found Paul Manafort to be a very nice man, and I found him to be an honorable person. Paul only worked for me for a few months. Paul worked for Ronald Reagan. His firm worked for John McCain, worked for Bob Dole, worked for many Republicans for far longer than he worked for me." Call this the very short period of time defense. The president is fond of using it, and there's no one he's not willing to distance himself from. But despite that, how critical is this news today in your view?
Well, at a very basic level, Mueller could not end his investigation without talking to Manafort. So even if he does not have the goods on a lot of other people, he was in the Trump Tower meeting, as you pointed out. And if you're Mueller, you need to talk to everyone you can that was there, because you have to turn over every rock to make sure that when you close up shop, you have looked at all the leads. So whether he has a ton of evidence that leads to other prosecutions or not, this is just an important thing to check off the box, because he has to talk to him. He was running the campaign at such a critical time when there was contacts with the Russians, and there are huge issues here about what the president knew about those conversations. And that's what he can answer.
I know you're not John Dowd's spokesperson. He seems to be filling that role himself. But what on God's green earth is he talking about that Mueller has no info on the president or the campaign?
I don't know, and I am not John Dowd's spokesman, and I struggle to understand him sometimes. What I do know about John Dowd is that he had conversations with Manafort's lawyers last year about a pardon.
Yeah.
And that is something that Mueller himself is looking at, the question of pardons and how they were using them to try and stop people from doing exactly what Manafort has done here, cooperate. Now, the president, as Dershowitz points out, is a much more difficult position to pardon Manafort, because if Manafort is talking, as he has been, to the government, and the president comes in to give him this, that is clearly trying to impede an investigation. John Dowd would take the argument that because the president is the head of the executive branch, because of Article 2, he can do whatever he wants.
Okay, Barbara McQuaid, put your former Fed hat on. If you're a member of the Mueller team, how significant is today's news?
Well, I think it's incredibly significant. Of course, Mueller and team know a little more than we do about what has happened already. My guess is that there would have been some conversation with Manafort already to assess at least the topics that he is able to deliver through cooperation before they secured this deal. You don't give away cooperation lightly. They did let up on the charges. They've capped his sentence in the District of Columbia to 10 years with these 2 5-year conspiracies. So they've given something up, and they didn't need to do that. They had a very strong case, very strong likelihood of winning at trial. And so in order to give that up, that means they thought they were getting something of value. So what usually happens is a cooperator, prospective cooperator's lawyer will come in and say, here are the topics he can talk about. There have been reports that Manafort himself has had some meetings with the prosecutors already, and so they likely know the areas he's able to cover. Now, it will take many hours over the coming days, weeks, and even months to sit down and really go over in excruciating detail all of the things that he knows. But I think Mueller is in very good shape and knows that Paul Manafort has things of value that he wants to hear more about.
Hey, Jeremy, under the heading of Manafort and the Russians, our mutual friend and FBI veteran Frank Figliuzzi said the following on the air with Nicole Wallace this afternoon. This certainly got our attention.
He has the history with Russian organized crime, intelligence service. I actually believe that there were Russian intelligence officers who were promoted the day that Manafort told them, I got the campaign chairman job. I'm in charge of the presidential campaign. And today, those same Russian intelligence officers, if my prediction is correct, are scurrying for cover.
So you have Paul Manafort deep in debt, offering to work for Donald Trump for free. Also, let's not forget his attorney today mentioning the safety of the Manafort family. This is like a float full of red flags, Jeremy.
Yeah, well, first, on nights like these, Brian, we have to harken back to first principles, which is, why do we have a foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia that makes no sense, that skews heavily in favor of the Kremlin, that looks to undermine NATO, the G7, the EU, and all of the multinational institutions that Russia fears? Perhaps it's because Russia's agent of influence, Paul Manafort, who is doing the Kremlin's bidding, let's not forget, in advancing the agenda of the Ukrainian leader Yanukovych and that political party. Paul Manafort was in charge for a brief time of the Trump campaign. He, of course, not only had a hand in the in the Republican National Convention, which had a platform that was mysteriously changed towards a pro-Russian position, and he, of course, also was present when the Russian delegation showed up at Trump Tower. And I just want to make sure everyone understands that Trump Tower meeting, Brian, was not random Russians coming off the street to offer dirt on Hillary Clinton, as has been described. It was a Russian government delegation coming to a meeting saying, we have already hacked Hillary Clinton's email and the email of her campaign and the Democratic National Committee. We're going to operationalize it. This meeting is not about that. This meeting is about what we're going to get in return: sanctions relief. And finally, Brian, on that issue of the safety of the family, I think with Paul Manafort now working for the U.S. government, there's concern that the Russians might target him and particularly his family.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.